Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take 2 data points and we use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist, actually is with us this week from Davos. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
Hi, so the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about the economics of Switzerland, which is where Davos is and where Adam is right now. So stick around to hear about secret bank accounts and watches and a lot of other interesting things about Switzerland. But first, we wanted to do something from the news, and the data point there, unfortunately, is 21. That is the number of people that were killed in the elementary school in the town of Uvalde in Texas this past week.
Good evening, fellow Americans. I had hoped when I became president I would not have to do this again. Another massacre.
It's not the first school shooting in the United States. Uvalde has joined other places that are already sadly familiar to us: Columbine, Parkland, Sandy Hook, to name just a few. And it probably won't be the last. You know, we were planning on doing a different segment here at the top, and school shootings really don't seem like a natural topic for an economics podcast, but we wanted to try to shine some sort of light on such a dark situation, and it struck us that the peculiar American economy that now surrounds school shooting, you know, the economy of school safety, could use some airing out. So, Adam, obviously gun control legislation has not gone anywhere in the United States, and I suppose, though, we can't say that the government hasn't done anything in response to school shootings. The federal government and state governments have spent billions on improving school safety in just the last handful of years. So where exactly has that money gone, Adam?
It really is billions. According to the best estimates I've seen, it appears to be in the order of $2 to $3 billion. I think it's per year. I mean, it just beggars belief. And it pays for this entire armory of things. You know, metal detectors, armored doors, huge amounts of surveillance cameras. Many counties, many school districts have central security offices, a bit like traffic control centers, to track dangerous movements around their premises. It pays for security guards in many American schools. And then more mundane things like, you know, technologies for early warning of various types, alarm systems. It's an entire industry, which in some states is, you know, there's a combination of both federal funding and state level funding for this. And states like Florida have appropriated up to $400 million for a variety of different school security measures. A bunch of stuff can be packed under that rubric because obviously school safety is something that passes well through the political system, pays for emergency planning, but also mental health programs, violence prevention, and then all of these training drills and the instructors that provide them that the poor kids are put through and the staff are put through as well.
So we talk about the gun lobby all the time in the United States, but I mean, this entire school security industry that you're talking about, has that become a kind of big economic player, a big lobby of its own?
I think it seems right to say that, almost in the way in which the focus on school safety in itself has a kind of distracting function. I mean, obviously schools ought to be absolutely safe and no child should ever come to any harm in a school. And the fact that they do is such an appalling reality that Americans and the entire world, in fact, that watches in horror. I'm in Switzerland right now, and the German news, the Swiss news are full of this story and America's anguish over it. And indeed the history, the Europeans track this. But in a sense, the focus on the schools, as terrible as it is a kind of ideological effect, because you refer to the gun lobby. There are an estimated 400 million firearms in circulation in the United States. And that is the gun lobby and sustaining those in circulation, the business that provide them and sell them, and the lobby that insists on the Americans' right to carry these weapons is extraordinarily powerful in political terms. And those weapons kill a lot of people, over 40,000 people a year. And of those people that die, roughly 10% are children. So In any given year, over 4,000 American young people fall victim to firearms, either in the street or in the home, either deliberately or accidentally through suicide or through murder. It is, the CDC reported ahead of the COVID epidemic, it had overtaken car accidents as the major source of death amongst young Americans. And what that means is that for all of the horror of school shootings, literally 100 times more young Americans are shot to death on the street or in their homes every single year. So for the horror of these school shootings, multiply it by 100 to actually capture the reality of the carnage inflicted on American young people. Over 90% of all of the children worldwide who fall victim to gun death outside war zones fall victim to gun death in the United States. It is the singular privilege of America's young people to be exposed to this risk. It is absolutely staggering when you think about it. The school massacres are simply in some senses, most obscene element of this story, because clearly schools we think of as places of safety.
Ah, goodness. That is very, very stark. You did mention the figures about spending on keeping schools safe, so in the order of $2 to $3 billion. This is money meant to secure schools against gun violence. I mean, if we just had to spitball here, I mean, could that money that's being used for security be used for something else instead in an ideal world? I mean, American schools do have other unmet needs beyond just security questions, right?
It's so difficult to talk about this without getting very upset. Yeah, obviously, yeah. The Century Foundation has an elaborate statistical formula through which they can calculate how much money would actually need to be spent on American schools to give kids in those schools a chance of achieving the average school performance of American school kids. So this is a test essentially of the disadvantage suffered by kids in poor neighborhoods, and it's particularly Black and Latino kids in poorer counties and school districts in the United States compared to their white counterparts. And on that basis, using that formula, you can estimate pretty precisely what kind of money would be necessary to bring those underfunded districts up to the national average. And the numbers are very significant. So for the top 10 underfunded school districts in the United States, the total extra funding need is $20 billion. $20 billion is needed, and we're being forced to waste money on school security because of this outrageous gun violence. In LA school district alone, the shortfall is $5.77 billion, according to this calculation. So if you ask whether there's better things that you could be spending this money on, I mean, it just screams to high heaven. Yes, of course. We should be educating kids and be putting teachers in a position to teach them.
Goodness. This just strikes me as kind of terrible negative feedback loop of a kind. I mean, we're throwing billions of dollars into an effort to manage this gun problem at schools, and the problem just keeps getting worse, and so we throw more money at it. You know, I mean, maybe even it's getting worse as a result of these interventions. I mean, you know, maybe we're creating the impression that schools are targets in the minds of people who are psychotic. I don't know, but just the way this market works, I mean, is that a pattern elsewhere, this kind of perverse kind of negative feedback loop?
Yeah, I mean, I think the security industry in general preys on our anxieties. I mean, the gun business itself does, right? I mean, the principal sale of guns in the United States is this perverse idea that people will be able to defend themselves against some sort of unnamed, but if you scratch the surface, fairly obvious idea of social upheaval, uprising, and it's often extremely racialized when you think about the anxieties that spread around the country when jails were emptied during the COVID epidemic, for instance. There's this idea that, you know, you need a weapon in the home to protect you and yours against the marauding hordes. And the security industry is the flip side of that. And I think it was the Washington Post ran a rather interesting article about there are trade fairs for school security. And the sale pitch is literally, well, just imagine you're going to be faced with one of these massacres, and say my security system costs $2 million. Is that too high a price to pay to save the lives of some innocent kids? Do the math. Like, I mean, how are school administrators faced with this impossible problem to make rational choices? Schools ought to be absolutely safe. There ought simply to be no question of this happening. And faced with this kind of risk, how much money would you be willing to spend to make your child at school marginally safer? I mean, it's an obscene question.
Yeah, I also do wonder how, when it comes to public spending, this is also one thing that Republican Party, which often wants to cut spending, doesn't seem to have any problem finding the money to spend more money for guns at schools. And that itself would cost money. It doesn't seem to be cheap to provide, yet more guns at yet more schools. But this feedback loop of anxiety seems to nudge in that direction. I guess finally, are there any economic studies that you know of, Adam, about the effects that the anxieties produced by these kinds of school shootings more generally? I mean, we've gotten used to saying the kids are resilient. I mean, that was something we always heard during the pandemic. But I don't know, does growing up in a kind of securitized regime, I mean, maybe it's comparable in some ways to a low-level war zone. Does that leave some kind of traceable residue on kids over their lives?
When I thought about this question at first, I thought, this is so wrong. This is so obscene. Like, there cannot be economic studies of this question. There cannot be, can there? But the world being as it is, there is, in fact, a paper by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the most prestigious publishing outlet for early stage research. So these aren't peer-reviewed papers yet, but they're on their way to being published in the top journals of economics. Came out in 2022. By Marika Cabral and a team of authors. And I'm just going to read the abstract because, it's a document of our times. Using linked schooling and labor market data in Texas from 1992 to 2018, we compare within student and across cohort changes in outcomes following a shooting to those experienced by students at matched control schools. We find that school shootings increase absenteeism and grade repetition, reduce high school graduation, college enrollment and college completion, and reduce employment and earnings at ages 24 to 26. So for just the state of Texas, there is in fact enough data of school shootings to be able to organize a matched and statistically representative sample. It's estimated that 311,000 American kids have been in schools which have experienced shootings in the last 20 years alone. 311,000 kids. So you can indeed do the math on this population. And what you find is that there is a very considerable increase in absenteeism, a very considerable, a really dramatic increase, in fact, in grade repetition. These are, in each case, of course, relatively small numbers, but the increases in them are absolutely dramatic. And you can actually cash this out. This has been going on for long enough on a large enough scale for you to be able to make economic estimates of the impact on people's lives of this trauma when they are young. And the economists involved in this study believe that over the lifetime of the people who were subject to this as kids, it will probably reduce their lifetime's earnings by $115,000. That is modern America for you. You can actually do this math because the data is there, because these incidents occur at such a horrifying level of frequency.
That's stunning. And again, it's not the results here that matter at all. It's not the outcome of this. It's the fact that the United States of America apparently is a laboratory for scientific research into the effects of school shootings because we have enough of them to run these studies. Well, there you go. That should be lesson enough, hopefully, for people in Washington to draw some conclusions. But I guess we shouldn't keep our hopes up yet there. But yeah, we will take a break and come back to talk about Switzerland. Hi, and welcome back. We are now on our second data point, and that is $87,000 US. that is the per capita GDP in Switzerland, and that makes it the second highest per capita GDP in the world. It's higher than every other country in the West, behind only the oil-producing country of Qatar, as far as I can tell. And it's extraordinary success for a very small, mountainous, alpine country without any oil. And yeah, who better to discuss the secrets of Switzerland's success than Adam Tooze, who's there right now.
The World Economic Forum annual meeting, where the brightest minds, most powerful political figures, and global industry leaders all make the climb to Davos, Switzerland, a town nestled in the Swiss Alps, best known for its long ski trails and beautiful scenery.
If there's one thing I would guess that the average person knows about Switzerland's economy, it's that it has bank secrecy. So I guess for the uninitiated here, I mean, we've probably all encountered that in movies or books or whatever, but what exactly does bank secrecy mean in practical terms? I mean, what exactly has traditionally been secret in Switzerland that has not been secret elsewhere? And how far back does this tradition go in Switzerland?
It is an old, ancient tradition in Switzerland. Switzerland is obviously made up of the German bit, which is Zurich, and then there's an Italian bit, which is along the border to northern Italy, and there's a Swiss part. And apparently the tradition of banker-client privilege originated amongst Italian merchants already in the 1600s in that Italian part of Switzerland. But the first formalization of bank secrecy in Switzerland was in the French bit in Geneva in 1713. And it appears to have been basically a bolt hole already then for the more or less ill-gotten gains of the French aristocracy, who wanted to move their money out of harm's way, and particularly out of the grasp of Louis XIV at the time, the great absolutist king, monarch, who declared, that the state is me, and so was the property of many of his subjects, even his aristocratic subjects. So that's where it got started. And then it was formalized in this extraordinary banking law the Swiss passed in 1934. And the key to it in Switzerland is that it's a criminal offense for a banking official to disclose information about a client's bank account without their consent. So that would be the name, the bank number, let alone what's actually in the bank account. So what the Swiss do is to criminalize the disclosure of information about accounts by bank officials. So that's a very, very powerful mechanism, because obviously the bankers don't want to go to jail. And at the time and since, the Swiss like to tell the story that they did this 1934, right? That's 1 year after Hitler came to power in 1933. Believe it or not, they like to claim that they introduced this to protect the assets of German Jews fleeing Nazi oppression. It's an astonishing act of chutzpah on their part, given what actually happened in Switzerland with fleeing the Jewish population of both Germany and Austria. And it's a complete myth. It's said that during World War II, the Swiss used to quip that 6 days a week they worked for Hitler's war effort, and on the seventh day they prayed for an Allied victory. So intensely were they mobilized behind the Nazi war effort. Really, the modern form of banking secrecy in Switzerland goes back again to the early 1900s and again to the Franco-Swiss connection, because in the early 1900s, in 1901 to be more precise, the French Third Republic introduced a much higher rate of inheritance tax, and promptly all along the border between France and Switzerland, banking houses sprang up and adverts were posted offering French clients protection for their wealth against the rapacious French tax authorities. By 1911, there was already very widespread French tax evasion in the Swiss banking system. So it's a very hardwired, very dug-in system, which essentially protects the anonymity. So, it's really an unknown unknown. A Swiss bank account is just nothing anyone knows about unless you tell them, because no one else is going to tell anyone about your banking account there. It's a form of absolute shrouded obscurity.
And just so I understand, that means it's even secret to the Swiss government itself, right? I mean, this is not just anonymity from sharing that information with outside countries. It's even anonymous internally to the Swiss government, the bank accounts.
Absolutely.
So, okay, that is pretty wild.
It is worth saying this is not your average bank account. So this is not your typical current account with a Visa card in it. This is private banking. So it's an exclusive group of banks which offer these services for very large bank charges
I see.
to private clients.
Have there been efforts, serious efforts by other countries to weaken Swiss bank secrecy? Or is this more like a situation where everyone kind of quietly benefits from having Switzerland available as a place for the dark side of global economics to kind of happen in the shadows? So they kind of tacitly allow this banker secrecy to continue.
There have been moments that had that kind of quality, especially during the exchange control period of the Bretton Woods system in the 1950s and 60s. Switzerland was a useful entrepot for offshore transactions. More recently, the United States Congress has taken a very firm line on Switzerland's secrecy and the services that it provides to the Russian oligarchs. Which is remarkable because in Tax Justice Network, which is generally regarded as the benchmark in indexing the highest levels of banking secrecy and tax evasion enabled by states, ranks the United States and the Cayman Islands both above Switzerland in terms of the loopholes that they provide. But in the end, the pressure on Switzerland after the revelations to do with the use of Switzerland as a depot for Nazi gold in the 1940s and the aftermath of World War II, and then big drives globally to try and crack down on tax evasion. In 2014, Switzerland did do a deal with more than 30 other advanced economies around the world to exchange tax information, including data from Swiss bank accounts of the largest clients in those other countries. So to that extent, Swiss banking secrecy is no longer what it was. But this does not apply to the rest of the world. So Switzerland shares information with other rich countries, which enables rich countries to pursue people who are evading tax in Swiss bank accounts. But it doesn't have that relationship with developing countries, low-income countries, and emerging market countries around the world. And so 90 plus major sources of financial flows to Switzerland continue to operate under the old rules. So it's called the so-called zebra stripe.
And so I guess looking at Swiss watches, I guess I wonder just, how big a business are these watches from Switzerland? And I guess more broadly, is there some internal connection, between the structure of Switzerland's financial economy that we've been talking about, these banks and, the investments from rich people around the world, and this kind of hugely successful business of selling luxury products like watches? I mean, is it just a coincidence that it sells, these kinds of luxury products, or do they go hand in hand with its, financial economy in some sort of historical and structural way?
I do think they are closely connected in the sense that it positions Switzerland in a niche, right? It's a niche success story. Switzerland produces just over 20 million watches a year, which is about 2% of the global production of timepieces, but it commands 50% of the value of the global watch industry. I mean, that's incredible, right? 2% of the total production, but 50% of the value, because the average Swiss watch sells for about $1,000 or for 1,000 Swiss francs. So super high end is the answer here. It's not a huge part of the Swiss economy. It's about 1.5% of Swiss GDP, apparently. Employs about 100,000 people. And rather sadly, the workers in the Swiss watch industry are not paid huge amounts. It's actually not a super highly paid sector. You might expect that, to work that way, but they're many of them are migrant workers from France, and they tend to earn fractionally below the average for workers in the Swiss economy, who are generally, of course, very highly paid. So it's a sector which has struggled over the years, as you perhaps expect. It's a manufacturing sector that was subject to really savage Asian competition from the 1970s onwards. Then managed to restore its brand image by going into the ultra high end sector, and then you had Swatch and the modern Swiss watch industry that came along with this new generation of newfangled timepieces. It's under pressure now from things like the wearables, like the Apple Watch, which is a similarly sort of high-end product for affluent consumers and competes with the Swiss. So it's not a huge industry, but it's typical of Switzerland that they are able to survive at all in a manufacturing sector like that by dominating the high-end segment of the market.
I mean, I'm maybe betraying my ignorance here, but is there anything specific about Swiss watches that do they sort of perform better, or I mean, anything that's particular that justifies that kind of luxury price? I mean, or is it really basically this is just conspicuous consumption?
Well, it is conspicuous consumption, but they are pieces of art. I mean, the fine mechanical operation of Swiss clocks is it's a craft and a mechanics and a form of engineering that's many hundreds of years old. They are undoubtedly the most precise mechanical clocks of their type, mass manufactured in any form anywhere. I mean, the Swiss, not just in clockmaking, but also in ultra high-end machine tool manufacturing, for instance, perfected really dramatically sophisticated engineering techniques. There were plants for the manufacture of very high-end machine tools that were seismically secure, buried into tunnels in the granite of the Alps so as to ensure an absolutely stable natural environment in which to produce these ultra-high precision tools. It's not for nothing, I think, that the Great Hadron Collider, the giant ultra-high energy physics system, I think people say it's the most complicated machine that humanity has ever produced. That it should be in Switzerland is no accident, I think.
Maybe those watches keep even more accurate time then as well. I guess finally, Switzerland, as I said at the top, is obviously a really successful economy. I mean, it doesn't seem any other way to describe it, but is this a model, do you think, that other countries could adopt or learn from, or does this really only work as a kind of exception in the global economy as a whole?
It's particularly interesting, I think, because it hasn't always been stand out for its wealth. So down to the late 19th century, it was lagged significantly behind the UK, for instance. The UK had a much bigger industrial revolution at an early stage, whereas Switzerland at that point already had substantial industry, but also had a large peasant agricultural sector. And though Heidi and cuckoo clocks and Swiss cheese may be cute, they're not a way to grow rich. The secret to Switzerland's success in the 20th century, which is when it catapulted itself into the very front ranks, is essentially to blend very high-end manufacturing that we've been talking about with this large export-orientated service sector. And it's the two things together that really give Switzerland its edge. It has to be said, it's in a rather favourable location at the absolute heart of Europe, at the crossroads of Europe. And to that extent, one has to compare it to other rich, if you like, economies of space. So I'm thinking of like the merchant fortunes of the Delta of the Rhine in the Netherlands, and cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, or if you think of the Thames estuary in London. I mean, the population of Switzerland is not larger than the population of London. So if you compare like with like, if you like, you shouldn't compare Switzerland with the United Kingdom as a whole. If you compare it with London, then Switzerland's advantage shrinks somewhat. But nevertheless, even allowing for that, it has made the absolutely best in economic terms out of the locational advantages that it has, being at the head, on the headwaters of the Rhine, on these crucial passage points across the Alps between France, Italy, and the German lands. For all of those natural advantages in location, it has also just simply made the best of its situation.
Got it. Well, we can all hope to be so fortunate as to be in the right place geographically like Switzerland happens to be. But yeah, in the meantime, I hope you enjoy your visit there, and we will leave it there for now. Okay, that's it for another episode of Ones and Twos. Thanks as always to my co-host Adam Tooze. Listeners, as always, we like hearing your feedback. Please email us at podcast@foreignpolicy.com or tweet us at onesandtwosepod. Remember, that's Tooze as in Adam's name, Tooze. And of course, remember to follow and review us on your favorite podcast app. Ones and Twos is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcast is Dan Efron. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.